So hi everyone, I'm Upasana. I work as a junior fellow at FemLab and I work on artisanal work. So my presentation today is going to be on platformization and entrepreneurship in artisanal work, but in Bangladesh. So the key argument that I want to present over the next 15 minutes is that artisanal work is a largely collective industry. It's evolved with rural collectives. And in order to revive this industry, we're now introducing platform interventions and largely individualistic models of entrepreneurship. And I'm trying to understand if that is an adequate solution in an industry, in a sector that is very collective in how it operates. So how this presentation is structured is I'm going to take you through the artisanal sector in Bangladesh, give a little bit of context there. Then I'm going to contextualize what digitization and platformization look like in Bangladesh. And then we're going to look at the key agents who are driving such transformations in the sector. So artisanal work in Bangladesh, by that I mean craft work, handlooms, and garment workers. Now, this is a traditionally geographically rooted sector, which is to say work is place-based. So all the materials that are used and how artisanship moves forward or evolves is based on the produce that's available in the region, the plants that are available in the region. So those materials determine what artisanship, what sort of crafts or handlooms are practiced in those specific regions. These are also largely collective activities. So these are done by communities and people coming together, and practices and norms and techniques also evolve in such collective ways. So for instance, I looked at two forms of handlooms. One is jamdani and the other is nakshikantha. So jamdani is a form of weaving mostly saris, which has an international reputation for a luxury good, and it's had that for a really long time, for centuries now, since colonial era. So it has it's very respected in global value chains, and making jamdani is a very long and intricate process. So it usually involves several weavers working together for a long period of time on specific techniques. So everyone has their own specialization that they're working on, and everyone works together to produce a jamdani sari, and it takes a long period of time. When you look at the nakshikantha, that's a more functional thing. It's made from worn clothes, actually. It's made mostly by rural women, where worn clothes are stitched together and then motifs are stitched on top of that. And these motifs usually draw from mythology or from the daily lives of women. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Nakshikantha is a space for a lot of women for rural women to come together and have a space of leisure together in each other's company that is not their domestic space, that is not the space of privacy in their domestic areas. And this goes to show how artisan work is really collective in nature, and there's no master creative genius at its core. All the practices, techniques of weaving, skills really draw from communities working together. Now, this is a sector that's seen a downfall over the last few decades, and this has been affected by urbanization and consequent labor migration because of lack of employment prospects. There are little to no market linkages. There are virtually no digital marketing skills in rural communities, and industry linkages in the sector are also largely absent. And all of this has affected the industry a lot. And this led to a lot of revival efforts around the 70s and 80s, which were mostly focused on knowledge production and skilling and archiving. But with the advent of, with the pandemic and the increasing dependence on online marketplaces, and digitization was hailed as a solution of sorts to revive artisanal work, as online modes of distribution, e-commerce, and platformization would indeed revive artisanal work in Bangladesh. And this is the notion that I want to explore a little more deeply in this presentation. So this is a quote from a concept note that the government of Bangladesh released in 2009, which delineated their vision for digital Bangladesh in 2021. So there they write that in many ways, digital Bangladesh is a reincarnation of the vision of Sonar Bangla, Golden Bengal. Now, the idea of Sonar Bangla or Golden Bengal is a reference to a past glory that the region had, that it does not have anymore, and it wants to achieve again. So there's an invocation of this past glory, and the route to achieving that is digitization. So that becomes a medium for achieving a sense of lost glory that the country once had. And this is something that I want you to hold on to for a while, because it'll become relevant in the next couple of slides. So now I want to look a little bit more on what digitization really looks like specific to artisanal work. So on the one hand, there are online marketplaces that mostly operate on social media. So social media, like Facebook primarily, has become a space where a lot of homemakers and women mostly market their products and try to sell craft work or jewelry online. And a lot of these deals happen on Facebook and on WhatsApp. So they exchange numbers and then sell their products online. And this has also led to the rise of networks such as the Women in E-commerce Forum, which has a lot of women entrepreneurs who come together to provide support to each other, to extend solidarity to each other, to build a network. And this is also a space to organize training and skilling programs for women entrepreneurs. Now, just to contextualize this a little bit, according to the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics, in 2019, approximately less than 9% of the poorest 20% households in Bangladesh could access the internet, and about 75% of the richest 20% could access the internet in Bangladesh. So that gives you a decent idea of who this online marketplace is probably skewed towards. What demographic gets to participate in a marketplace that is operating on social media, that requires you to be comfortable with using technology and with having reliable internet. So that's one kind of digitization and online marketplaces that are at play. The other is the emergence of new kinds of platforms in the space of artisanal work. So now these are really driven by two major forces. And one of them is slightly related to the past and one of them is related to the future. So there's a nice tension that exists there. And you can see that really clearly in the quote that we discussed, which was that digitization will be the route to achieving past glory. Because one of the forces at play here is the strong association that artisanal work has with culture, with national identity, with Bangladesh having a national image that is strongly drawn to its cultural identity in global value chains. And the other force is that of automation anxiety. Is the idea that a lot more machines will replace entry-level workers in the artisanal industry, in the artisanal sector. And this is dominantly like entry-level work is dominated by the female workforce. So the threat of worker displacement is a really gendered threat. So these are the two primary forces that are sort of shaping how platforms emerge in the sector. And while I was talking to one of the upper management of a platform that works specifically on skilling garment workers, we were talking about how the platform really started. And this is what they had to say about that. So here the upper management talks about their founder who came across a lot of research that spoke about how about 64% of the workforce in Bangladesh was female, but that has fallen now to less than 50%. And the question is, where has the 15 or 14% of the female workforce gone? And then they started telling me that this was something that stuck in the mind of the founder. And she kind of vowed that this is a place where she can do something. So that's how it started. And that's basically to help the vulnerable female workers. So that's the bottom line. And here we see how social entrepreneurs sort of emerge as a key agent in driving what the industry looks like, driving what the sector looks like, driving what transformations in the sector look like. And these entrepreneurs get to decide what workers need saving in what way they are to be saved, what are the interventions that are required, what constitutes a culture that gets to be revived. Who decides? They're the people who start to decide what cultural identity Bangladesh will have in global value chains. So they become really important actors, sort of determining what the industry is going to look like moving forward. Academic work on social entrepreneurship identifies it as a space where individualistic, entrepreneurial, and neoliberal means are exercised in order to achieve the common good. So in trying to change the world, social entrepreneurs and their norms and practices create a sort of entrepreneurial quality in people. And in emerging economies, this is harnessed to build the nation, to produce values, and to construct and establish new markets. So that's what one side of platformization in the artisanal sector looks like. If we come back to what e-commerce and online marketplaces on social media are doing, what they create is they make the figure of the artist entrepreneur a really central part of what platforms and digital interventions in artisanal work really look like. And this follows a pattern that was set in the global north following the rise of Etsy. Now, Etsy is an online marketplace, mostly for crafts and jewelry, and it's dominated by homemakers and women, mostly white women. And Etsy as a platform has not only created a space, but in fact encourages sellers and women to talk about their private lives, their personal narratives, what their domestic space looks like. So their self or their personhood becomes a part of the brand that they're selling. And these patterns are largely replicated in Bangladesh. So when on Facebook, people start selling their crafts or their jewelry online, it becomes important to also market themselves, also market their narrative as women entrepreneurs. So the brand that they're creating online is not just about the product that they're selling, but also about their own personality and their own personal narrative. And that becomes an important part of how social media as an online marketplace starts to operate. And when you look at the rise of groups such as the Women in E-commerce Forum, we see how competition and solidarities can coexist in creative work. Because obviously the women that are part of this network are competing for the same audience, they're competing for the same market, but they're also there to provide each other support, to learn together, to get skills together. And you see these as a space where competition and solidarity can really coexist with each other. And I found this very interesting in how it's prevalent in online creative work. And looking at the importance that social networks have here and social relations have here, and what it means to extend these networks in order to look for economic opportunities in extended social relations, that's also a really interesting space to explore in the kind of interventions that digitization and platformization make possible. And these are all avenues for further research that I think would be really interesting as well. But if we take stock of the industry as it is right now, we see that entrepreneurs of two different kinds, either social entrepreneurs or artist entrepreneurs, get to drive the industry, get to or get the limelight in an industry through media narratives, through digital intermediation. And they get to take charge in a way that leaves no space or agency for the rural collectives with whom craft work has evolved. Because artisanal work has evolved not just with the communities, but the sort of relationship that these communities have had with the places that they reside in, with the environment that they live in. And all of these voices, all of these ideas have no space in how the industry is moving forward at present. So to label as revival a transformation that does not account for their voice only adds to the marginalization of an already vulnerable group. The artisanal sector is facing a huge number of problems, such as unemployment, inadequate skilling, no market linkages, labor migration. And the solution to all of these is largely legal and infrastructural in nature. It would involve labor laws. It would involve stronger social security laws. It would involve interventions that systematically try to create archives of knowledge, of techniques, of artisanal practices, and also try to educate people once again in artisanal work, and treating entrepreneurship as a substitute for these solutions is a really inadequate way to approach what revival looks like in artisanal work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pasana, for that very interesting insight. I would invite Professor Harmony for more questions and remarks.
Upasana, thank you for your presentation. I went over the blog post based on which you've called this as well, and I found it wildly interesting. So I'm going to pick on something that actually stems from your conclusions, because that was the bit that I think the central tension that you kind of highlight really comes through there. In the blog post, you get into this in some detail, but when you say that neoliberal and entrepreneurial solutions to deeper issues plaguing artisanal works, unemployment, inadequate skilling, eroding resources, etc., are not going to, magically disapparate because of these tech solutions that are being proposed at the moment, the only answer really to me would actually come from, as you were pointing out just a moment ago, the state and some amount of legislation within this space. But as you point out, that is unlikely to happen. That is unlikely to happen because the state is ceding ground on a very routine basis within these spaces. So within a scenario where the state no longer, if you will, is willing or able to make this cohere, what really are we left looking at? Because then are we relying exclusively on the kind of potential femtech solutions that seem to slowly be, promoted as if they were the only panacea to these problems? What do you, what do you have to say about that? Because this just feels like it feels like an impossible kind of space to find ourselves in.
Right, I quite agree with that, to be honest. And during my interviews, I was speaking to the founder of a platform, and that platform basically works as a knowledge hub of sorts. So e-commerce is possible on the website. They do sell a lot of muslin products, but the website also works as a space to archive what weaving looks like, what the techniques of weaving are, what the history of artisanship looks like. So I feel like that is I personally think that's a really good approach to it, because that's also respectful of the histories and traditions of the communities. But they spoke to me about state interventions as well, because we went into that. We went into what state policy, state support looks like. And he described to me how for the state also it's a matter of who gets to take credit for reviving this industry. Sure. So framing it as that has been helpful in order to get more attention and support, because that helps. And he was very honest really during the interview, where he said that whatever political party comes to power, you just need to remind them that it needs to be in their agenda and they get to take credit. That, it was during my rule that this was really revived, that so much of this industry is has come up when we came into power.
Might I ask what some of that may have looked like? I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but because you said that he said it managed to elicit some kind of support, if you like. So what concrete forms has that taken coming from the state?
It's really interesting. Jamdani had a little bit of there was a problem with getting the GI for it, which is the copyright equivalent in creative work spaces, which is the copyright equivalent there. And there was a problem whether it belonged in India or in Bangladesh, and it finally went to Bangladesh. And that's what it looks like when you operationalize it, because that was a fight there, and we got Bangladesh was the one that won that one. So that's what it looks like operationalized, and that was a big deal. Declaring it as heritage or getting more global attention to it as heritage is what it looks like on a very material scale. It's also a question of funding. And we had that conversation, like that was also part of our conversation where he described that, state support looks like funding, and this is the kind of funding we got in the past, but we don't do that anymore. And we're not doing that because it's largely bureaucratic in nature. And he highlighted how bureaucracy was really slow. So even with the intention of, I will get credit once this is revived, or more, I don't know, altruistic intentions of just reviving this, even if we were to assume that, it's still a very bureaucratic solution to the problem. And he seemed a little more intent. I got the impression that quicker solutions were more important. So perhaps platformization or tech interventions can provide that. But it's interesting how the platforms that are coming up are not just e-commerce based. Like you would assume they're following an Etsy model directly or entirely. That's not the case. As you see with the rise of this, the goal is also to create a knowledge hub. As you see with the rise of the other platform, where the goal is to skill workers, to skill garment workers. The idea there is not just to sell more things or just to monetize it. So there's definitely a good kind of platformization, a little more comprehensive kind of platformization also that we can see rising in this industry for sure.
Sure. No, I see where you're coming from also, because that kind of leads me to something else that I kind of noted while I heard you speak, which was that I was going to ask really for instances where we were talking about the kind of cooperation existing alongside competition that you were outlining. And I think one of the central tensions there, as your presentation highlights for us, is the difference between thinking about social entrepreneurship and the artist model of entrepreneurship, if you will, where there is this kind of, I suppose, some sort of focusing on the individual genius that creates a work of art/craft. And of course, that flies in the face of everything that we've been talking about, because you talk about how these are extremely collective traditions to begin with when they're kind of envisaged there. So the kind of thing that I mean, one of the things that came to me as I heard you speak about Nakshikanta as well, was that it actually fits a contemporary discourse of upcycling incredibly well, because you're talking about something that draws from the everyday and attempts to leverage or create the new, if you will, out of what already is. So is that a discourse that they're trying to wrap this in? And my last comment/observation has to do with the fact that basically worldwide, Bangladesh is known as the warehouse or the manufacturing hub for fast fashion, for mass-produced garments. So are these the panacea? Are these the antidote? Are these the corollary to that? And is that why so many of these traditions, as I think Pooja pointed out in a lovely observation earlier as well, have so much to do with this notion of identity building? Because they matter, and they come as an antidote to thinking about this in slightly more industrialized, mass-produced modes of operationalization. Just that.
So in the platforms that I spoke to, that I was able to talk to, don't actually go into the upcycling idea of it, but there were other platforms that I was looking at and reaching out to in the process as well. And some of them do go in with the idea of creative tourism. I largely related to that. So the idea is that, we will introduce you entirely to the cultural landscape of Bangladesh, or we will introduce you to the cultural landscape of so-and-so other global south country. There's a certain element of exoticization that's definitely involved. And there, craft becomes definitely a luxurious item. Craft becomes definitely something that is, sustainable, and it's alternative capitalism, and it's so tied to your own labor can be put into this, and it's labor of love. All of that narrative really goes into these ideas, but these are also not platforms that work out of Bangladesh, So these are also platforms that are based in other countries that are also treating Bangladesh as a space of tourism. So they're not really talking about how for them it's not about, for the workers that is, it's not really about sustainability. or about this being a luxury product outside of the livelihood that it grants. And that's not really a part of the conversation. But it definitely fits into the whole idea of sustainable living and upcycling really, really well. To answer your second question, yes, most definitely that came out. That is the idea that they're going in for, in trying to either skill their workers more so that they become digitally literate and really good at using technology or working with technology, or in trying to put out an image of Bangladesh that is so rooted to its artisanal work, to its cultural identity, to luxury goods, to items that are intricate to produce and that have so much value. They are trying to move away from the warehouse identity, from genuinely trying to reform their identity in global value chain. So that's definitely working at work here. Yeah.
Okay. Anupama, do we have time for another question? Or
I think no, we are running out of time.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll stop.
You.
But Upasana, thank you so much. That was really
Thank you
interesting.
so much.
Thank you, Professor Harmony and Upasana, for this wonderful discussion.